So let's look at overtime, because there's lots of ways we can calculate overtime, and there's a lot of JC, yes, tips are taxable. There's a lot of different ways to calculate overtime, and there's a lot of different things that we have to make sure we are applying consistently to be able to calculate overtime correctly. So every company, every place you work has to have an established work week. Now this work week is any 7-day consecutive period of 24 hours. Now most of us will have a job, the norm is that your job is going to start at like 12 a.m. or 12:01 on some weekend day, maybe Saturday, and it's going to go all through the week, and it's going to end at 11:59 or 12 o'clock on the following the week, right? So Saturday to Friday. But if you have my son, he works at a cheese manufacturing company, and they're open 24/7. So they have 3 different shifts throughout the day. And so their work day might start at 6 p.m. on Sunday, right? And go till 5:59 on the following Sunday. As long as it's 24 consecutive hours, 7 days of 24-hour periods, then that's the work week. And they can't change it. That work week is always the same. They can change it. It takes a bit of doing, and you have a short week computation, but pretty much once you set your work week, you stick with your work week. Your work week does not have to be in alignment with your pay periods. In other words, I mean, it has to make sense. You only have 7 to 10 days to pay somebody after the end of the pay period. But if your work week is Saturday through Friday, you could still pay employees on Wednesday or on Monday or whatever day you wanted, as long as you adhere to the law that says when you have to pay your employees. For instance, in California, most employers only have 7 days, calendar days, to pay employees. So if your work week stops midnight at Friday, like this example shows, the employer has to pay you before the following Friday at midnight. Okay, they can't pay you on Saturday, or they're in violation of California law, unless you're semi-monthly with the standard semi-monthly, the 1st through the 15th, and then the 16th through the end of the month. That's a standard monthly, semi-monthly pay period, and they can pay you 10 days after the end of that pay period. So basically, if you just remember, you're typically going to be safe if your employees are paid within 7 days of the last day of the pay period. You're going to be fine, and you're going to be in compliance with how often you have to pay employees. Okay. As we mentioned before, California has overtime that is more generous than federal overtime. Federal overtime is just 40 hours in a week, whereas California overtime is 8 hours in a day. Anything above 8 hours in a day is going to be overtime. Anything more than 40 hours in a week, just like federal. And then any hours worked on the 7th day of that work week. Okay, and this is where some people get a little confused. They think any consecutive 7 days, that 7th day has to be paid overtime, but it's not. Okay, let's use the example of the work week from Saturday through Friday. If you start working on Wednesday and you work 8 days in a row, starting from Wednesday through Thursday, you have not worked 7 consecutive days in the work week. Okay, even though you worked 8 consecutive days, it was over 2 work weeks. So the employer does not have to pay overtime for that 7th day. Okay, it's the 7th day in a work week. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, I'm gonna keep on going. What a dirty loophole. Yes, Josh. Some states, yeah, there's a lot of crazy things that some states do, but yeah, my little 70-year-old mother, she was working at Lowe's, and they would literally work her 10 days in a row then give her 3 days off, and then work her 9 or 10 days in a row again, because they could. And I'm like, well, this is, you're too old to be working like that. So she got them to change her schedule, but it was by law, it was allowable, and they didn't have to pay her overtime when they worked her for those 10 days in a row. Okay, so the Federal Labor and Standards Act, the FLSA, is the organization who sets the overtime pay at 1.5 times regular pay. Okay. Basically, anything overtime has to be paid more than your regular rate of pay. 1.5 times your regular rate of pay. I always used to use $10 as an example because it's such easy math, right? Even though that's below our California minimum wage now. But if somebody's making $10 an hour, time and a half is 15, right? 10 times 1.5 is $15. So anything overtime has to be paid at $15. And if an hourly employee works in pay periods that are 2 weeks or longer, they can elect, they can elect to give time off in lieu of overtime, but it has to be in the same pay period, okay? So that's kind of like a comp time, right? In California, there are some rules that kind of make that less feasible, but it can be done. So instead of getting paid overtime, they can get, so if you, let's just say you have a 2-week period, you work in 2 weeks, you get paid bi-weekly, and you work 50 hours in the first week, and so the next week, instead of working 40, you could take, that employee could have 15 hours off instead of 10 hours off, right? Because it's time and a half based on overtime. I hope that makes sense. Okay. Now, employers, this is something employees sometimes ask questions about. Well, can my employer require me to work overtime? Absolutely, they can. If you decide you don't want to work overtime, you can be terminated. It's a condition of your work. So just because you don't want to work overtime doesn't mean that the employer can't require you to work overtime. Now, in today's job ads, that should be part of the posted ad. They should say, you know, overtime will be required, or some overtime will be required, or something along that in the job posting. But they should, if the employer asks you to work overtime, it's part of the job requirement. Okay, I have a question here. Employees on salary, are the employers obligated to pay overtime? Okay, so salary is a whole different discussion, and we'll get to that in a few minutes, because there's a difference between paying somebody salary and somebody who's legally exempt from overtime provisions. So we'll get to that and those definitions shortly in this lecture. Good question, Fernando. Okay. So some employees have exceptions under the FLSA that have different overtime rules. Like hospital employees, overtime is 80 hours or more in an 18-week period, okay? Or 8 hours in a workday, whatever's greater. There are some special rules for retail and service industry employees, or employees who are also receiving remedial basic education. And we don't have to worry about that too much. We're not going to go into those exceptions. We're just going to go ahead and talk about comp time now. So comp time is, you know, what we just talked about briefly a minute ago. It's giving employees time off in lieu of overtime. So instead of paying them dollars, you know, in their paychecks, you can, an employer might offer you comp time. Comp time is an area that gets abused all the time. Employers just do not understand the rules related to comp time, especially in California. There's a lot that has to be done to actually have comp time. So you got to make sure as an employer you know all the rules. But generally speaking, for federal purposes, Sorry. An employee can have comp time, and depending on their industry, it will determine how many hours that can be accumulated in that comp time bucket. And what you have to remember here is if an employer is providing comp time, that comp time is in lieu of getting actual pay. So when an employee leaves the organization, whether they're fired or quit, that comp time has to be paid out when the employee leaves. Just like vacation time has to be paid out. It's something that has been earned, and so it must be paid upon termination or separation from the job, from the employer, okay? So you can see public safety, emergency response, seasonal activities, they can accumulate up to 480 hours of comp time per year. Actually, that's a cumulative one, okay? And other employees who aren't in that exception can accrue 240 hours of comp time, okay? Again, California, the rules might be a little different, so you want to make sure and be familiar with that if you're going to offer comp time. Okay, so what is exempt? And some people think just because their employer is paying them a salary that they're considered exempt. Exempt and salary are not, they don't always equal. Sometimes somebody who is salary is exempt, sometimes they are not. Basically, to have somebody who's exempt, and when we say exempt, it's exempt from the FLAS provisions, at least some of them, a lot of them. And the things that are mostly exempt from are those overtime calculations. So there's a couple of different classifications of employees that are exempt by definition. And we'll look at the figure on the next slide of those who are considered white collar workers. So you can see this little guy over here on the screen. He's half white collar, half blue collar, right? When we think of white collar workers, we're thinking about those professionals, administrators, computer professionals, you know, the big wigs of the company. And blue collar workers are people who work in getting their hands dirty, right? So they're doing the physical labor, the working in manufacturing, whatever. There's also now pink collar. I guess us ladies have to be part of that collar color. I don't know exactly the definition, but it's basically a job that's like a hairstylist or manicurist or something that's more in the service industry is a pink collar. So Sylvan said, I always thought exempt equals salary, and most people do. Exempt does not always equal salary, okay? So Juan, you said the same goes for sick time that are not used. That is incorrect, okay? Sick time, by definition, by law, does not have to be paid out when an employee is terminated. PTO, by definition, has to be paid out upon termination. So it's really important that employers call any paid time off specifically what it is, okay? So Juan, that was a good comment that you put, because I wanted to point that out. That sick time is a type of paid time off that is not required by law to be paid out when an employee is terminated, unless the employer has it in their handbook that it is their policy to pay out sick time upon termination. Okay. Now, somebody who's exempt from the overtime provisions of the FLSA has to be paid at least $455 a week and be paid on a salary basis. Okay. Now that dollar amount, 455, was the 2019 number. On the next slide, we're going to see the 2020 number. The change went in on January 1st this year to increase the minimum salary for an exempt worker. Okay. So in order to be exempt, most of your work has to be has to be one of the white collar workers that are on the next slide that we'll talk about, right? So it has to be certain professions. So exempt is not just your employer hires you and says, okay, I'm putting you on salary, so you're exempt from overtime. It has to meet the definition under the law that says they can be exempt from overtime. Okay, otherwise employers would pay everybody exempt and not give them overtime that they deserved. Okay. Sick time is considered a benefit. Okay. Amber asked, is sick time considered a benefit of the employer if it is included on top of PTO? Yes, it's considered a benefit. In the state of California, it is now a required benefit for employers to offer 3 days of sick time per year. They don't have a choice. It's legislatively required that California employees offer 3 days of sick time. I think there is a carve out for employers who have less than 5 employees. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's required by law in California that each employer give 5. Yes, see, I believe it's only 5 employees that might have an exemption for not offering sick time. Okay, well, we can look at that a little later. Okay, so salary must also always be paid for the full week, no matter whether the employee worked 40 hours or not 40 hours, or whatever the agreed upon time was. So let's just say you work for a non-for-profit company. Not-for-profit companies are famous for having 35-hour work weeks. I've always wanted to work for a not-for-profit so I could only have 35-hour work week. So they have 7.5-hour days, but the salary is, for that week. So whether your work week is 35 hours or 35 hours or 40 hours a week, it doesn't matter. If you work 30 hours a week, your employer cannot dock you pay. The only time they can adjust your pay for a proportion of your salary is that first week. So if you start on a Wednesday and the work week is Monday through Friday, they cannot pay you for Monday, Tuesday because you weren't hired then, right? Same thing when you terminate. If your last day is a Tuesday and the work week goes through Monday through Friday, they can pay you for Monday and Tuesday only. That's the only time they can take a proportionate share. Now, that doesn't mean that they can't, an employer could require you to use sick time or vacation time if you didn't work, say you only worked 4 hours on one day. They could say, okay, well, you got to use 4 hours of your vacation time or PTO or whatever. And if you keep doing that, they could lay you off for, they could fire you for not working enough hours. But if they hire you as an exempt salary employee, they have to pay you the full salary, regardless of how many hours you work, okay? And blue collar workers, they're always entitled to overtime pay. So police officers, EMTs, firefighters, paramedics, LPNs, those people are entitled to overtime based on their job description, okay? In fact, they have all sorts of fun different pays as well. Like they might have a shift differential. If they're working in the late hours of the night, they might get a little extra. Or maybe an employee who works in a certain jurisdiction, right, of say that you work for the LA County Police. Maybe if you're in Watts, you get a higher rate of pay because you're in a more danger-ridden neighborhood. I don't know, but they have differential pay. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. And just this is a nice little summary of some of the key differences, not all of them, but the key differences between exempt and non-exempt employees. And remember, when I say exempt, we're talking about, by definition, exempt from the FLSA overtime rules, okay? So a non-exempt is entitled to overtime pay. they get paid a salary or an hourly wage. It doesn't matter. You can pay a non-exempt employee a salary, but if they work more hours or less hours, you might have to pay them overtime. They can earn any amount, they could work in any field, and they don't have to worry about what's called the duties test. And we'll look at the duties test on the next slide. Exempt employee, on the other hand, they're not entitled to overtime pay. They're not paid an hourly wage. They have to earn in 2020, this is a 2020 slide, they have to earn $684 per week. Now remember, on this last slide for 2019, which the textbook has the 2019 numbers, it was $455 a week. So when you do your homework, it's going to be based on $455 a week, okay? Because that's what was the law when the textbook was published. The job must fit into specific categories, and it must meet a duties test. And we'll talk about the duties test next. And so this on the side here, it's that 2020 update, right? So the exempt salary raised from $455 a week to $684, which is now $35,568. So somebody cannot be exempt from overtime law unless they're paid at least $684 in a week, okay? Now in California, it's even higher. So in California, the law is if somebody is going to be exempt in California, they have to make 2 times the minimum wage, okay? So if you work for an employer that has more than 26 or more employees, that's $54,080. If your employer is small, 25 or fewer, then it's $49,920. So that's the annual overtime in California. So it's all based on, in California, the state minimum wage that applies to your employer to determine what the minimum salary is for an exempt employee. So you might qualify to be exempt based on the federal guidelines, but in California, if you're not making basically $50,000, you cannot be exempt from overtime, okay? Does that make sense? Does everybody understand when we're talking about exempt? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so here's some of this is from table figure 2, whatever, my thing is over it. Figure 2.2. These are some of the categories that qualify an employee, a worker, to be exempt. You can be an executive, okay? To be an executive, to qualify as an exempt employee under the executive exemption, your primary duty must be managing. And that means you have to have 2 or more employees under you. You have to have the ability to hire, fire, and promote people, right? You can't just say, oh, I'm a manager, but have no employees under you. That does not make you an executive if your title is manager, but you have nobody to manage, right? I've known a lot of people who have worked at small companies, and they're called the sales manager, right? Well, they're the only salesperson. So if you don't have anybody to manage, doesn't matter if your title says you're a manager, you have to have people to supervise. Sorry. Okay, you can qualify under the administrative exemption. And the primary duty there is performing office work, but that's not all. Both of these things have to apply. You have to regularly use discretion and independent judgment, okay? So this is the, office manager maybe, who, she's making the appointments for the boss, and she's, ordering supplies and this, that, and the other. Well, if the boss has to sign off everything she does, then she's not using independent judgment and discretion, right? But if she has the authority to make those purchases and to make those appointments and make business decisions, then it qualifies as an administrative exemption. Now, the professional exemption, basically, this is, do you have education, right? Did you get the education necessary to be a professional? This is where the CPA comes in, right? This is where the lawyer comes in. You had extensive, my dog is scratching at my window. You have extensive knowledge, extensive education, right? Knowledge acquired by prolonged course of instruction. So this is typically beyond the bachelor's, okay? Education beyond the bachelor's. And it requires advanced, right? That advanced knowledge. The next one, oops, too many. Oh, okay. Business owner, that one's pretty straightforward. If you're the owner of a business, of course you can be exempt, because you basically, as the owner, you can kind of set your own rules. I mean, within reason. But if you're actively managing the business operation and you own at least 20% of the equity of the company, you don't have to be paid overtime. And they usually aren't even paid. A lot of times owners aren't paid at all. They take draws, or they find other ways to get paid through the company, but they do not have to be paid overtime. Okay. Then a highly compensated employee, I don't necessarily agree with the dollar amount that the textbook has. They have 100,000 or more. If we go to the DOL fact sheet, and this isn't just 2020, this has been for a while. So the DOL fact sheet, sorry, it is 2019, if I would have read this top thing. So you can see through December 2019, the standard salary level was 100,000. But now with that overtime rate increasing, where did it go? It's like here it is. Highly compensated employee now for 2020 is 107,432, okay? 107,432. That means you're a highly compensated employee. If you're getting that much, the employer does not have to pay you overtime. So it doesn't matter if you're doing, one of the things that doesn't, not one of those other exemptions, but you do still have to perform non-manual work, okay? So, and some kind of exempt duties. So this isn't the person who's out there building widgets and working lots of extra hours to build up his quota. Now he's a highly compensated employee because he's just jamming out those widgets. He or she has to be somebody who's not doing manual work, okay? And then there's a special carve out for computer professionals. And again, that was $455 in 2019, and it's now $684 a week. But basically their duties are consisting of system analysis and designing computer systems, and they have a special carve out. In California, they're actually much higher than the regular hourly rate. And I didn't look it up. It did change in 2020, but it's higher than the standard minimum wage in California, right? Higher than the minimum salary. So just keep that in mind. Computer professionals can be paid a higher rate in some states, especially, we have Silicon Valley where all our computer geniuses are. So where is my mouse? There it is. Okay. The last two are creative professionals. So this is your artist, your actor, your singer. They can be exempt from overtime because their job is basically one of creation, right? I guess you can't put a number on overtime when you're creative. I don't know. But it is something that it kind of fits in with the professional, right? Where it's something along, you've studied it for a while, you've put in the time, and so now you have the ability to be this creative person. So you'll see sometimes now you might have something that qualifies in kind of two places. You might have a creative professional who's also a computer person, right? The web design and all that kind of stuff is a creative professional in the computer field, okay? Then outside salespeople, they are exempt from overtime, and there is no salary test. So they don't have to have that minimum salary, but just by their duty which is something that is they're going out, making sales and collecting orders for services or goods. And they're usually away from the employer's place of business, right? Outside salesman means they're outside with the public. There's no salary tests, and they can be exempt from overtime. So those are the standard classifications that are exempt. Does anybody have any question about any job that you may have had, or a question about some position that you might want to be curious if it's exempt or non-exempt according to FSLA? No. Okay. Hopefully you all, anybody who's not getting paid overtime falls into one of those exemptions and is not getting paid overtime legally. Every time I teach payroll or we discuss payroll in the accounting class, there's always somebody who says, oh, I'm not being paid legally. I'm only getting hourly. I'm getting a salary, but I don't do any of that stuff. And I work 60 hours a week and they're not paying me overtime. So you need to know when an employer is required to pay you overtime so you don't get the shaft.